health and medicine, or health and the people, medicine through time paper. So if I can ask that you turn to question 1, and you have a look at question 1 on page 2 there, and what you can see is you've got to read the question clearly, because if you don't read the question clearly you can make a mistake. The question will focus you on something in particular. So the question says, as hopefully you can see, study source A in the sources booklet. How useful? The question will always begin with that question stem. It will always ask you the same thing. How useful is source A to an historian studying vaccination? So you know that the question focus is vaccination. In other words, you need to look at source A, and the first thing you're going to have to do is say, well, what is source A telling me about vaccination? Not about anything else. That is what it's focused on. I'll be really clear about that, okay? Then it says, explain your answer using source A and your contextual knowledge. We'll come to what that means in a moment. So the first thing I want you to do when you get this is to think, well, what is this source telling me in this case about vaccination? So let's have a little look at it. Okay, vaccination. This is a cartoon. Okay, I'm going to just read through this, and I'm going to underline anything that I think might be important when I answer this question. So I know that it's a cartoon. That might be important to me if I'm making a judgment about it. I know that it was produced in 1802. That might be important as well. We'll come back to thinking about why. It's always worth reading this little bit of information that we call the provenance, because it might help you in your understanding of the cartoon. So it says, it's generally thought to show Edward Jenner giving his patients the new inoculation at St Pancras Hospital in London. However, historians have suggested that the patients are Dr. William Woodwards, who ran the hospital. He was in dispute with Jenner after some of his patients died from smallpox when he used Jenner's technique. Okay, remember, the question is asking us, what is this cartoon telling us about vaccination? And if we look at this cartoon, there are things we need to sort of pick out from it that are going to help us understand. And the first impression I get when I look at this is not a positive impression of vaccination. This is quite a negative impression of vaccination. Why do I think that? Because here is Jenner. It tells us that, doesn't it? Here is his process of vaccination. Okay, in other words, Jenner's technique. But what's it doing to the people that he has vaccinated? I hope what you can see, and admittedly this is in black and white, and it would be in colour in the real thing, which would make it clearer, but we can make the assumption that this vaccination is turning people into some sort of hybrid monsters, where they are being turned into some strange mixture of animal-human. So, to pick up 2 marks straight away, if the question asks me, how useful is it studying about vaccination, I'm going to have to say what it's telling me. So for me, the meaning of the source is the first thing I look at, and that meaning is that vaccination was a pretty negative thing, because it's changing people in a pretty much horrific way, isn't it? Now, what am I going to have to do next? That's only going to get me so far, because I really can do that without an awful lot of knowledge. The next thing I'm going to have to do with a how useful question is I'm going to have to use my contextual knowledge to explain what's going on here. So my next bit of the process is my contextual knowledge, or my knowledge. I'm going to have to use that to explain what is happening. So if I go back to it, I would want to see you, Year 11, write on this source. This is yours to write on. And if you make your notes, it makes your writing up that much easier. So if I can see that it's turning them into some kind of weird animal human, well then I want to use my knowledge to say that he used cowpox in order to vaccinate people against smallpox. In order, in other words, to protect them against it. I am using my knowledge to explain why the cartoonist has drawn things this way. There's nothing in this cartoon which tells you that. You know that, therefore you have to explain it yourself. Okay, that is using your contextual knowledge to explain what is going on here. And you could develop that, couldn't you, by saying that obviously this cartoonist is being rather negative about that because some people died when they tried to use his technique because they didn't really understand entirely how to use it. Now, as well as using your contextual knowledge, the other really important thing you're going to have to do is you're going to have to refer to a word I hope you know, which is the provenance. And for that, you've got to think about who made this source. When did they make it? And the most important thing I really want to impress upon you today is you've got to think about the purpose. All sources are made with purpose. You just got to work out what that purpose is, and it will affect your understanding of why it is useful. So if I go back and have a look at the provenance, what I can see is the first thing I'm going to see is it was made in 1802. Now that was just after Jenner had made his discovery. So that's why I think this cartoonist is being so negative, because it was very new at the time. It was a really new thing and people were really worried about it. So I've used the date to kind of try and explain that. It's a cartoon, and what I can say about cartoons is they're often exaggerated for comic effect, okay, which probably limits its utility to an extent. What else can I say about this as the purpose? Well, I think this is a very negative view, and its purpose is probably to be critical of Jenner and his methods. And how do I know that? Because at the time there was an awful lot of fear about vaccination because it was so new and nobody really understood it properly, with the exception of a few people like Jenner. So why is this useful? It's useful because it really helps us understand, A, that there was new scientific developments at the time where Jenner was trying to find ways of helping protect people against a deadly disease, smallpox, but it's also really useful because it helps shows us that there was a great deal of fear around its use because it was very new and nobody quite understood how far it was going to work and how it was going to replace what had come before it, which was inoculation, and hopefully you remember. Now what you've noticed is I've focused very specifically on why this is useful. Can I ask, my second really important thing, as well as always focusing on the question, is focus on why it is useful. One of the things the exam board criticises is when students say this is not useful because it's bias. This is not useful because it doesn't tell me this. They want you to say why the source is useful. All sources are useful, it just depends what you're trying to find out. In this case, this source is useful because it really helps us understand people's fear around vaccination, which was very, very new, and what it might do to people. Okay? And that's why it's useful. Alright? That is your how useful question. Remember, 3 things. Even if you don't know anything about it, you can try and get something about the meaning of the source. Secondly, try to use some of your knowledge to explain what you see going on here. And thirdly, try to make a comment about the provenance. You know, why is this person producing this source? That is a tricky question. It is. It's one of the harder ones, which is why I've spent so long going over it. But it's really worth getting right. How long do you spend on it? Well, actually, it's 8 marks. So really, we shouldn't be spending more than 10 to 12 minutes. If you find yourself going over that, and it's really easy with a question like that, move on. You've got to try and answer every question. Okay, that's my first one. If anyone has a quick question, please ask me now. Yes.
How much do you think we should buy?
That's a difficult question, but what I would say is keep the meaning no more than 2 sentences. Keep it short and snappy and straight to the point. Maybe use 2 pieces of good knowledge in explaining the context, and maybe say 2 further things about the provenance. I think you could do this fairly straightforwardly. If you were succinct and to the point, you could do it probably in 8 sentences, good sentences. So you don't need to write tons and tons and tons and tons and tons, but what you write has to be really valuable, put it that way. Okay, I certainly would try. I mean, you could do, if you want to do it in paragraphs, you could do a message broadly on the meaning and contextual knowledge, and a paragraph on the provenance as well. The problem is with saying how much should you write is you can write an awful lot, but it can be meaningless. Do you know what I mean? I'd rather you wrote less, but what you wrote was really, really focused and clear about those three things. Okay?